Hi everyone, and welcome to this Accountants Daily webcast. I'm your host, Miranda Brownlee, editor of Accountants Daily. Today we'll be exploring some of the emerging fraud threats targeting businesses and the strategies that you can employ to detect and mitigate against them. I'm joined by two experts in this area, Roger Darvall-Stevens, partner and head of fraud forensic services, RSM Australia. With over 30 years of experience in forensics, Roger provides expert advice to clients across different industries. He has extensive experience in forensic investigations and forensic accounting across a range of matters such as fraud, bribery, corruption and improper conduct, forensic technology, operation of whistleblowing reporting avenues, and management advice. We're also joined by Justin Campbell, Solution Engineer at ApprovalMax. Justin helps businesses to implement financial controls and approval workflows as part of his role at ApprovalMax and has over a decade of experience in the accounting software and S&B software space. Thank you both for joining us today. Before we get started, we've got a couple of poll questions to get through. Firstly, what do you see as the biggest fraud risk for businesses today? We've already had a fair few votes, but I'll just give half a minute more for everyone to respond. So it looks like invoice and payment fraud is the largest threat. Oh, actually, no, impersonation scams is overtaken. Followed by invoice and payment fraud, and AI-driven fraud schemes also a big concern as well. Just give a few more seconds. I can see people are still voting. Okay, and our second poll for today, which will start now, is how confident are you in your organisation's ability to detect and prevent fraud? Just give a minute for everyone to put votes in for that one as well. Seems like somewhat confident is the most popular answer so far. So a bit of a mix of responses, with some very confident, a few not very confident, and most sort of in that middle kind of area where there's some confidence in terms of how well your organisation is dealing with fraud. All right, just a reminder before we jump into the discussion, you can submit any questions that you have through Slido, and we've already had a few questions come through, so thank you for that. I'll now hand over to Roger, who's going to give us a brief rundown about some of the methods that fraudsters are using at the moment, particularly as we see technology evolve in areas such as AI. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Much appreciated. I'm honoured to be here today. So I'll just give a little bit of an exec summary of the fraud landscape. So just to go back to definitions, fraud is dishonestly obtaining a benefit. That can be for the fraudster themselves, can be for the organisation, can be for another organisation or another person. And then there's also corruption, which is closely aligned at times, and that's the abuse of entrusted power for personal, private or political gain. So sometimes, for example, in the procurement process, you might have conflicts of interest, you might have collusion with parties, with an employer and a vendor to pad up some sort of contract or set of payments. I will quote a few things from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And if you don't know of that organisation, it's a global anti-fraud association with 90,000 members in 190 countries. They also have a certification, CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner, of which I am, and they produce a lot of really good materials. So, for example, a 2-yearly global fraud study. And there's a 13th one out at the moment from last year. And so that's, you can go onto their website and freely download a lot of that material, which is good business case material sometimes of when, what is fraud and how is it occurring. So, and part of that, some of the highlight items in that are that 5%, it's estimated across all industries, 5% of revenue can be lost due to fraud. Now, you're probably looking at your own organisation going, is that, are we losing 5%? It could be that you're only losing a small percent, but if you're a financial services organisation, you're more at the 5% or higher, and that's part of doing business. And also the sort of frauds I'd like to just basically talk about and then get into the technology aspects of it and AI, etc. So the typical fraud case does last 12 months before being detected. So it's much better to have controls in place to prevent. Often they're manual, but if they can be automated, that's even better, to prevent it occurring. Because when it does occur, it'll take at least 12 months or maybe even longer to detect it. Because often fraudsters will start with a small amount, build up, they'll test it, see if they get detected, and if not, they'll continue on. So the classic fraud schemes fit into 3 buckets, if you like, loosely, of asset misappropriation, which is any money flows in processes. So accounts payable fraud, accounts receivable fraud, payroll fraud, procurement payments fraud, and similar types. Then you've got an asset theft. Then you've got financial statement fraud, which is cooking the books or fudging the figures for benefit. And then you've got corruption, and that's a conflict of interest, collusion with someone to obtain some sort of benefit. So asset misappropriation schemes, the data shows us, is the most prevalent and the lowest the lowest median loss of 120,000 on average. Financial statement frauds are the least common but the most costly at 766,000 median loss, and then corruption schemes fit somewhere in the middle. So, and if we're also, that's domestic fraud, so if we're to your organisation, but there's also global bribery and corruption, foreign bribery. So if your business has any dealings overseas, for example, using agents or intermediaries or importing or exporting or has a presence overseas, there's a whole foreign bribery legislation, for example, in Australia that applies to doing anything around the world, and other countries also have legislation that covers the world. So the stats on that are 5%, ironically, they're similar. 5% of the world's gross domestic product, or US dollars 5 trillion, can be lost globally due to corruption. So now I want to move on to, so what does that mean? There's your classic fraud schemes, right? How have they changed? I'm here to tell you they haven't changed. But what has changed is technology and the enablers to commit that fraud. So it may have been paper-based or more manual attempts to commit fraud, but now with technology, with AI, there's just so much heightened risk of all the traditional types of fraud being committed by using that sort of technology. So it's where fraud control intersects with cyber security, if you like, and there's cyber fraud. So AI-related fraud we'll talk about. Business email compromise is a type of fraud where there's an impersonation of someone. For example, and criminals do this, they'll look at LinkedIn or Facebook and they'll notice that the CFO is on holidays in Fiji. sending some great pictures and saying, I'm really enjoying a break from work. So then they'll probably go onto the website of the organisation and extract whatever data they can to then impersonate the CFO to send a request that's urgent, usually via email, to someone in the finance team to say, look, I'm on holidays, as you know, but this urgent situation's come up, and if we don't change this destination bank account for this vendor to this, or if we don't make this payment, something drastic's going to happen to the business, and so it forces it to happen. You might think, like I do, why don't you just ring the CFO and ask if it's genuine? People don't necessarily do that, and so then they get they become the victims of business email compromise, or BEC. Identity theft and fraud is another one. Extortion, hacktivism, ransomware, malware or scareware used with worms, Trojan horses, spyware and keyloggers, all sorts of things to try and get your confidential information and access that. There's phishing via email, vishing via voice by phone, smishing via text, quishing now via QR codes, and farming via installing malicious code into a PC through clicking on a link often and purporting to be from a reputable company to induce confidential and private information release and transactions and all sorts of stuff. So I'll move on to AI, and it's a little bit shocking because the future of AI in a McKinsey report predicts that in the year 2300, AI capabilities will rival humans, which does not surprise me, but it took me a couple of times to just absorb that and think about it. So 60 countries currently have national AI strategies, and 4.4 trillion annually is generative AI could add to the global economy, it says. However, you may have heard of a recent, relatively recent deep fake example that's doing the rounds as a great case study for everyone that's on this webinar to use. And by the way, if you need any of the material or the references I quote, don't hesitate to send me an email or contact me, because it's my contact details are on the RSM website, or you can just Google me. Or have a look at my LinkedIn profile of my WTF What the Fraud posts, because there's a lot of them. So this one was a finance worker at a multinational firm who was tricked into paying $200 million Hong Kong dollars, or US 25 million, or Australian 37 million, to fraudsters who used deep fake technology to pose as the company's chief financial officer in a video conference call. So the worker did the right thing. He actually got an email which talked about a secret transaction, which is not common language and would be a red flag to most people. And so he thought, well, I'm not going to take that email on face value. I'm going to organise a video conference with my colleagues and who's requesting this, and I'm going to get comfort before I make the payment. So the worker put aside his early doubts and was duped into making the payment after the video call, who he thought were people like Justin and myself on this call, were not really Justin and myself. They were deep fake recreations of Justin and me, and purporting to support that transaction. So that's the sort of latest thing that we're talking about that concerns everybody, and that we should keep a lookout for. Of course, AI can be used for good and it can be used for bad. So many of us are using AI for good, for example, identifying patterns and anomalies in data, automating fraud detection, predictive analysis, enhancing risk assessments, improving customer experience, and streamlining investigations. Although there's a cautionary note here about be careful about whoever in your organisation is using AI, that they're using that responsibly and not putting private confidential information in public generative AI models. So then you've got the sort of AI used for bad. So you've got fraudsters who are now using AI to write code to steal data and ways to install backdoor access on software. Writing encryption and decryption code, which fraudsters can then use for ransomware and theft of protected or encrypted data. And then fraudsters using AI or bots to maintain multiple profiles to commit all sorts of fraud, including romance scams for individuals and, of course, business scams as well. There's something called FAS or FAAS, which is fraud as a service. And there's a lot of rhetoric on this at the moment, which is very relevant, about creating a new breed of fraudsters. So what that is that, you know, you can go onto the dark web and actually buy kits and have, there's a 24/7 customer support and all sorts of things to a kit to commit fraud, different types of fraud. And you pay for it and you get support and, you know, you can ask questions and answers and all the rest of it. So what that is doing is changing the landscape where people with no or little IT knowledge can actually commit fraud. So the fraudster profile of someone in their, you know, 36 to 46 is now potentially changing to teenagers and young adults who are doing this and committing fraud, you know, such as high-profile data breaches and financial crimes and distributed denial of service attacks, ransomware, etc., by using some of these kits. And so I warn you about those as well. I do want to just mention that if your organisation is using AI for good, do make sure that there's, for example, an AI policy from your information security management system or CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and that there's awareness training so that people know. We certainly do this at RSM, so we have a cordoned off AI ability, and then we certainly have policies, procedures, and then access that can protect confidentiality. I suppose I might leave it there, Miranda, if you like, and more you know, happy to go into the prompts that you've got and questions and answers as we go.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was really insightful. It gives us a really good overview of what's happening in that fraud space at the moment. We've certainly had a few questions come through already, which sort of relates to what you were speaking about. You obviously mentioned AI, and that example with the finance work in Hong Kong has obviously been a really significant example of what can kind of go wrong. We've had a question around what kinds of things you're seeing in terms of how fraudsters are using AI to impersonate. Are you seeing sort of other examples, or is there ways that they might use that in the future to target businesses?
Yep, it's more what I'm seeing with our clients and interested others is it's the business email compromise. It's the any means through text, through, I mean, we've all probably got texts ourselves or audio messages saying that you owe money to the tax office, or, hey, it's your daughter here, I'm stranded and I need you to transfer me $1,000. So it's that applied just as easily to businesses, either through emails or through, you know, that example, that Hong Kong example. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that we've had a bit of an uptick of individual business people in organisations being the target to identity fraud. And so just a little bit of a tip, if you haven't done a credit check on yourself, it's worthwhile doing to see that any credit that has been applied for, like a phone plan or a home loan or a car loan, has actually been approved and you know about it, or if not, there's a number of steps you can take. So there's a number of reputable credit association, or, you know, organisations that you can do your free credit check through, and the OAIC the Information Commissioner is a good government website to go to that will give you some guidance on how to do that. So we've had some business people say it's not a fraud on the organisation, but it's been a fraud on one of our executives, and that kind of is the tipping point of leading to other things. And what do we do?
Yeah, okay. So with some of these fraud attempts becoming more and more sophisticated as we see advances in technology, how can firms improve the way they're detecting fraud?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you've got your classic, I suppose there's entity level fraud controls and then there's process level fraud controls. So the process level fraud controls are things like in accounts payable, for example, of segregation of duties, of physical controls to limit access to certain things and IT programs, rotation of duties, awareness of employees of what to look out for, data analytics to make sure that's all happening. But a lot of those things tend to be manual and you know, of course, you've got management supervision, monitoring and review, you know, your schedule of delegated authorities, etc. But it's about, is that consistently applied? So, you know, and this will dovetail in nicely with Justin later on to talk about if you can have automated solutions, it's going to help and give you some degree of assurance on that. So that's process level controls. Then there's entity level controls. For example, if I go on about this in a number of presentations and talk to clients, but if you, and I know there's quite a number of people on this webinar, you represent an organisation, you're often in the finance function, but if your organisation doesn't have an effective whistleblower or public interest disclosure, if it's government, program that people feel comfortable to raise concerns, you're missing out, because 48% of fraud in Asia Pacific is detected by someone having the courage to speak up. So some of the entity level controls, fraud controls, are, you know, whistleblowing if you're in the private sector under the Corporations Act, which is, you know, in the last few years, the legislation has absolutely gone up and the protections, and it's awesome. And you've got to watch out because there's some criminal offences, like if an organisation is required to and they don't have a whistleblower policy and program. And also, if you're a government organisation, you'll have a public interest disclosure or similar legislation, state or Commonwealth, that applies to you. There's also other entity level controls like a fraud and corruption control framework encapsulated in a document of some sort, a policy procedure, and then it's operationalisation of all of that in prevention, detection and response activities, including a fraud and corruption risk assessment to know what is the most relevant risks that you're mitigating for your organisation.
Okay, I'll go to Justin now. Justin, obviously you look at fraud in depth in terms of a technology perspective. What kind of role does technology play in terms of identifying instances of fraud?
Yeah, well, there's several things, of course, with the technology that, for example, it can detect that it's come from a new supplier, and then force you to sort of have to go through a process of getting a new supplier approved, which might be a multi-step process where different people review it. There's changes of bank details that can be detected, duplicate detection. But I think really like the biggest thing is to move away from these email-based or paper-based manual systems and having a set process. Like thinking about the story Roger just said in Hong Kong, that where the CFO was on holiday. Well, our product has a substitution feature when somebody goes on leave, that approvals can go to someone else. And then I was also thinking that even if the CFO said, "Oh, put this payment through," there should still be a process where a payment would have to go through multiple checks to be approved to be paid. And I think you can have all these policies and reviews and so on, but unless you have the technology in place that sort of automates the multi-step, it goes to this person, then it goes to that person, then these things start being done manually, where people are just sort of the accounts payable person is just going in the software doing the payment manually, and that's where the likelihood of this fraud being effective is much higher. So I really see as making good process automatic is really the key thing that we do to help.
Yeah, okay, so the technology is really important for, I guess, enforcing those processes and approval workflows that you should have in place in a business to prevent some of those threats that we talked about before.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's funny that this isn't new either. I remember reading in Peter Thiel's book about the experience at PayPal, and this was like 20 years ago, that that the fraudsters were always working out clever ways of beating their system. And what they kind of came to is actually that they needed a combination of automation and analytics to detect potential fraud, but then they needed the human element, the human to be able to detect things, because the fraudsters were very good at working out what the computers can and can't detect. So, but that combination of having a human and the analytics really quite dramatically reduced fraud. And I don't think anything's changed really. As AI gets better, it's going to be just a combination of AI and well-trained, well-educated people who'll prevent it.
Yeah, okay. Just moving on to external fraud. What kinds of prevention strategies should firms be implementing to protect their business against external fraud? Is there any sort of particular strategies that they should be looking at? Perhaps we can start with you, Justin.
Yeah. Well, I think for preventing external fraud is really about having a good process for how any bills should be entered, and a consistent process and a multi-step process, and that things go to review, and then also having processes around creation of new suppliers, and then also processes around updating of any bank details. So Roger gave an example earlier of the bank details changing. Well, regardless of whether or not the CFO sends an email through or not, there should be a a process for reviewing that and approving it.
Yeah, okay. And do you have anything to add to that, Roger?
Yeah, sure. Totally agree with what Justin said. From the sort of the higher level, finance function should cozy up with the IT function big time, because it is about having that fraud and corruption control framework, which includes all these aspects of foundational elements for fraud and corruption control and prevention, detection, response, as well as the link to the information security management system and those sort of standards. So I'm a huge rap for standards. There's a lot of international and Australian standards that are really helpful here and will support exactly what Justin and I are talking about. For example, there's an Australian standard on fraud and corruption control called AS 8001 2021. There's also IT standards, ISO Information Technology Security Technique Standards of 27,000. There's also the Essential 8 maturity model for IT and cyber security. The Australian Cyber Security Centre is an awesome location website to get guidance on some of that sort of stuff. the SOCI Act, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act for Commonwealth, and National Institute of Standards and Technology NIST framework as well. So they're just examples. What I'm saying is those things should be taken into account at an organisational level by the senior people in finance and IT, and then operationalised down so that the whole internal control framework is humming.
Okay. And looking at internal fraud measures, what kinds of measures should firms have in place for preventing that?
Do you want me to kick off, Miranda?
Yes, yeah, we can start with you, Roger.
Sure. So I kind of look at the life cycle, if you like. So firstly, employment screening. So it's very key, and there has been some discussion of criminal organised groups planting employees in organisations, government and even state actors doing it in government or private sector organisations. Then once they have access to the data, causing all sorts of trouble and compromising that. So employment screening is important, and most don't realise there's a workforce screening standard called Australian Standard 4811, came out in 2022. And that talks about vendor screening, which is really relevant here for that as well, but also employee screening. And that's not just pre-employment, but that's post and periodic. So if someone moves to a finance function, or especially a higher risk function, you might want to redo some of those checks again, like a national police check and all sorts of other checks with their permission, of course. So that's that aspect, but also internally, the awareness is important. So for one client organisation at the moment, we're in the middle of delivering 25 fraud and corruption control employee awareness training sessions. It's 1 hour on MS Teams. It's similar to this Zoom webinar where people can interact. And it's about that awareness. Do people know what to look out for? Do people know where to report it? Do people have confidence that when they report it, if they want to be anonymous or kept confidential, that'll happen? And then management can have that information to then pursue that, to then make sure, for example, manual processes are automated, as Justin talks about, or that there's a detection of it so that it gets investigated at an early stage before it becomes much larger. So they're the basic things of basically getting some sort of whistleblower or public interest disclosure report where people, because it's mostly employees, see something that's not right, but they need to be encouraged to speak up. There's some examples.
And Justin, anything that you think firms should be doing in terms of perhaps using the technology to create some controls in this area and prevent internal fraud? Justin, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Look, I feel that one of the biggest things companies can do that they don't is that they should be doing job rotation and vacation leave. Like, one of the biggest red flags is when people will insist on still doing their accounts payable approval function when they go on leave, since I've been at ApprovalMax, I've been following fraud cases in the news fairly closely, and the number of times that it's like an entrusted employee, and that they've just been given enormous trust, nothing that there's never been like a second check after it, and unfortunately sometimes it results in these businesses having to shut down, and it can be quite disastrous whereas you can quite easily make it easy to substitute someone in using software, or for example, if they're the one submitting the invoice, making sure that that they can't also be the approver for the invoice. So that's a way that technology can help having good processes help support those good processes.
Yeah,
Could I add to Justin, Miranda? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
So I did want to give a example of a case study, Justin, spot on. It is so, it's almost counterintuitive. You think, oh, surely that's an old-fashioned red flag, but it is so prominent in most fraud cases that the person doesn't take leave. And the reason is that, of course, someone else has to do their job and then they'll see what they're doing. So we investigated a $3 million fraud for a client. And this is exactly what happened. The accounts payable person didn't take leave, she was a model employee because she did all the bank reconciliations on her own. She kept all her books and records immaculate, but there was no segregation of duties. And then she went on leave, someone else had to do her job, and they found out there was a duplicate payment for every vendor payment that was going to the accounts payable person. Just a cautionary note for those CFOs out there. The CFO at the time, when I interviewed him, he said he wasn't implicated in it, but he didn't review things properly. And he said the classic, all I did was replace good practices with trust. Is there anything wrong with that? So I then had to explain there is a lot wrong with that. And the client decided to no longer have the CFO employed at the organisation after that. So unfortunate story, but yeah, totally agree, Justin.
Yeah, it seems like a good process to follow anyway, having better processes around that rather than relying all on one person. So we'll just move on now to staff education. Obviously, that's another critical sort of part of preventing fraud alongside all those other controls that we've gone through. Roger, what types of education should businesses be undertaking with their staff? What kinds of things do you sort of recommend to your clients and the firms that you work with?
Sure. This is a bit of a lawyer answer, but it depends. And the reason why it depends is because it depends on the size of the organisation, the type of organisation, its structure and all the rest of it, even geographic spread and all that sort of stuff. So having said that though, the sort of awareness training that we get involved in for clients that we find is beneficial for them is general employee fraud and corruption control, employee awareness training, whistleblower program awareness training, also bespoke training to different areas. For example, you'll find the procurement function, there is no training out there on procurement fraud. And so depending on the size of the organisation, you've got a whole lot of really good procurement employees in that function, but they've never been trained on what to keep a lookout for, and it's relatively intuitive. Also, some people with fraud control responsibilities at an executive or management level would benefit from, for example, I mentioned the CFE Certified Fraud Examiner credential. So of the ACFE, there's a lot of finance people, internal auditors, all sorts of people that will do that either 4-day course that then enables them to sit exams to become a CFE, which covers a whole lot of prevention, detection, response aspects on fraud, or do a self-learning online module that can be done through the ACFE. It's a little bit self-serving because we exclusively run the course in Australia for people that want to do that 4-day instructor-led course, but I attract you to Google it and have a look and see if it suits. And it's also good for CPE and continuous education for employees and showing investment in someone that has a fraud control function.
And Justin, is there any types of education that you think businesses should be focusing on with their staff?
Yes. So there's sort of that very high level aspect, and then there's sort of, I guess, the practical day to day. How do you actually go in and review and approve an invoice or a new vendor approval and so on? So I feel like providing training over on the software can really go and should be combined with providing the kind of training that Roger is talking about, and the two together I think can really really strengthen it. I suspect a lot of the vulnerabilities in companies happen due to limitations in the software or the limited availability of user licenses. And for example, if a company is using not using an ERP, they're using say Xero, then they can't really invite people into the Xero file because the level of access is either far too limited or it's far too broad. And one thing we do with ApprovalMax is that the user role allows you to only see the things that you need to be approving. And so just that basic training on how to use the software can really sort of support the practical implementation of these policies and procedures.
Yeah, okay. We also had a question from one of the audience members just around, we spoke a bit about all the sort of threats that AI creates, but they also asked the question, how can we sort of use AI to detect fraud as well and perhaps predict patterns of where it will emerge? What are you kind of seeing with that, Justin? Do you think that will sort of develop further in the future, what we can do with AI to sort of prevent fraud as well?
Yeah. Look, this is a rapidly evolving area. One thing we do in ApprovalMax is we help enter the bills. We have a product called ApprovalMax Capture, and that's a fairly new product, but as that continues to improve, we're adding more and more AI elements to it, so to not just automate the entry of the bill and to prevent accounting errors, but potentially, for example, detect things like a change of bank details or things like that. And I suspect as things continue to evolve, there'll be more and more, and potentially it might look for signs in the future that something has been AI generated, or the possibilities are endless, and I think that'll just be a continuing arm race between fraudsters and fraud detectors.
Yeah. And Roger, anything to add to that one?
No, I think I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Okay. We've obviously covered a lot in terms of the prevention and detection of fraud before it escalates into a more serious issue. But where a business has fallen victim to fraud or a suspected scam, what should they sort of do in that situation? Is there any tips on what they should and shouldn't do in that kind of circumstances?
Shall I kick off?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So, I love investigations. We certainly breathe, eat, and love investigations. So, when a client has an issue, look, I had one client, this is many years ago, but the CEO said, "It's Friday afternoon. I've found someone committing fraud. They're in my office. I've told them they're not allowed to leave till they confess." And I said, "Whoa, let's go back a step here." So usually it's going to be through a whistleblower or a public interest disclosure report, someone having the courage to speak up, or it can be through data analytics or fraud data analytics or a review process of a function. We talk about predication for an investigation. So that is, it's something called, it's from the ACFE, it's the fraud theory approach. So predication is defined by the ACFE as the totality of circumstances that would lead a reasonable, professionally trained and prudent individual to believe that a fraud has occurred, is occurring, or will occur. So if you've got that, you can then do an investigation. If you don't have that, you can be accused of victimising somebody for just plucking them out, saying, "Oh, let's have a look at his expenses because we really don't like him anyhow and want to get rid of him." No good. So for a number of reasons. So if you've got predication, you can Google the ACFE fraud theory approach and you'll get a step-by-step process. The only thing with that is just to watch out for, there's a number of trips and traps about whistleblower legislation, public interest disclosure legislation, that you can commit criminal offences without inadvertently doing it. because you're not experienced as an investigator. Evidence preservation and integrity to lead to writing a report that the client or the organisation may use to either report to police or regulatory authorities and or to sue for recovery or dismissal of employment or making a number of other actions in there. So it's got to have integrity. What I'm getting at is if you within an organisation have experience and the qualifications to do an investigation, totally understand to do it internally. If not, outsource it to an investigator or investigation firm like ourselves who have like investigation licenses, because we're required to if we're doing investigations for other organisations, and you know, control them with the project management of getting them to provide a scope of work for doing an investigation, keeping to it and reporting factual findings on what they find. And that set of findings should also include internal control improvements. So what led, if it's proven, what's led to the fraud and how to prevent reoccurrence.
Okay, and Justin, any other advice that you'd like to offer? What kind of role does technology play, I guess, in terms of providing the evidence for these sorts of investigations?
Yeah. Well, our with everything we approve, we attach an audit report to it, and that gives you the approval log of what's been approved. So definitely having something like ApprovalMax in place would hopefully help prevent the fraud in the first place, but then it would also give you a pretty clear trail of where process was followed or perhaps where it was bypassed, and probably make the investigator's job a lot easier. But I mean, just from my sort of career experience, more with employment, industrial relations law, I'm just thinking that being cool and bringing in a professional and following proper procedures is probably a really good idea.
Yeah.
And if I could add to that, because I didn't mention, you're right, audit logs, because often there's a financial trail, and also, for example, when we do an investigation, we get read-only access to Xero or whatever accounting system, so that we can't change anything or be accused of changing anything. And you're right, the logs are really important. And there's other experts that you can bring in as well, or the investigators should bring in. For example, forensically obtaining the emails, maybe imaging a laptop or two, mobile phones if they're work-related and not bring your own device. And so, yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, okay. And Justin, with some of the sort of emerging threats in the fraud space and how quickly they're sort of evolving, how does sort of ApprovalMax manage those kind of threats, and what are you working on to sort of safeguard any future threats that are happening in the AI space and with technology advances like that?
Yeah, well, in the last 12 months, we did a big improvement in our review step. So before things go to approval, it can go to a review step. So that's one thing we've improved. We're also with our capture when entering bills, we're also improving that to be better at detecting, for example, duplicate invoices, but then also things like bank details that have changed. So those are some of the things that I can think of. The other thing we released is the ability to allow approvers to be able to edit certain fields, and then that all goes into like the audit trail. And another thing we released was a version history to the product as well, so you can see the different all the different changes that have get made. So the more and more kind of improvements we make there, I think all helps to support good practice.
Yeah, okay. And Roger, we've obviously talked a lot about the sort of threats that are happening at the moment, but you talk to firms all the time. What are the kind of key concerns and worries that they have in terms of fraud at the moment, and what kinds of advice are you giving them?
Yeah, it's really about what they don't know, you know. It's about refreshing their fraud and corruption risk assessment. And so knowing what fraud risks are most relevant to their organisation. And when that refreshing is happening, it should coincide with, you know, doing a good Google search and a whole range of things to find out what sort of frauds have occurred in that industry to other organisations that might be relevant to take into account for their own. There's also a whole range of little things they can do. And for example, I think organisations don't take advantage of exit interviews as well as they could. So people, the history or the data shows that people will leave poor managers, not poor organisations. And so sometimes there might be, I'm stereotyping here, but a manager who is dictatorial, all the rest of it, not good culture, but there's also that risk-taking behaviour may have an overlap with their committed fraud or something. So also something else we do for clients and suggest is a all of organisation survey. So depending on your organisation, they might get survey fatigue, because some organisations, especially in the public sector, will get a lot of these surveys, like code of conduct surveys. But a fraud and corruption control awareness survey to see if people are aware of things, if they've seen or been asked to do anything improper, and what that is, and if they're happy to give their details to be contacted for more information. And we find every survey we run, there's probably either 0 through to 3 matters that are raised that require investigation. And so otherwise it wouldn't have, been aired.
Okay. And just to finish off, Roger, do you have any final tips or key messages that you want to share just in terms of fraud prevention in general?
Excellent, Miranda. I've got 5 tips because you told me this was a question. So my tips are this. 1, have a fraud and corruption risk assessment. Know what risks you're mitigating because you're putting effort, time, money, etc. into it. So know what you're mitigating. 2, do controls testing. So a lot of organisations, that's probably a part that's missing. You may or may not be large enough to have an internal audit function that helps with that, whether it's internal or co-sourced or outsourced. If not, have some controls testing programs. So there's another website called the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre, which is a Commonwealth government website, but it's like the ACFE in the sense of it's a one-stop shop for better practice in fraud and corruption control that you can download. Some things you can't, but you can freely access the website and download most things. And it sounds like it's only for government, but it's actually the same principles apply for government and private sector in this space. So they have like a pressure testing guide and a whole set of tools that can help. So that's pressure testing high risk business processes as well as controls specifically. Then 3, do a check on automating those controls or what controls can be automated to help the organisation mitigate the risks of fraud. And then 4, whistleblower, public interest disclosure if you're a government organisation, programs to make sure they're in place and working and effective. And for example, ring up in the middle of the night your whistleblower program and see if someone answers. We actually operate a whistleblower program for 25 clients, and when we test for other clients, we will ring their whistleblower program or public interest disclosure reporting portals in the middle of the night. And 5, have a fraud and corruption control framework, policy, procedure, awareness, and operationalise or implement all those aspects of that. You know, by the Australian standard, 8001. Have a look and see. There's quite a good checklist and see what you're not doing that you could implement to strengthen your organisation. They're my 5.
Okay, yeah, that was really helpful. And Justin, any other advice that you would like to offer?
I would just say if you look after today and you're thinking about your processes and you know that the main way you approve things is by sending emails back and forth, then maybe consider going to ApprovalMax.com and and having a chat with us.
Yeah, and I understand that you've got a free trial at the moment, so
That's right. Yes.
yes. So are they able to just jump on the website to access that?
Yes, that's right. So we integrate with Xero, QuickBooks Online, and NetSuite. So if you're using any of those free products, you can set up a trial, and then of course we'd be in contact with you. We'd talk to you about how to best set it up, and we'd go from there.
Okay. We'll wrap up there. I'd like to thank our 2 fantastic guests for today, and thank you for all the insights and tips you've provided for businesses. I'm sure everyone got a lot of insight out of that. Thank you also to everyone who tuned in. Just to let you know as well, the recording of the webcast will be available shortly online. Thanks everyone, and bye for now.
Thank you.